Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Evelyn Lim. I am the Director of Policy and Research at the American Cornerstone Institute. Today, we have Dr. Ben Carson, ACI's founder and chairman, of course, the 17th Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient, and world-renowned neurosurgeon. Also joining us is Jim DeMint. He is chairman of the Conservative Partnership Institute. Mr. DeMint has a long history of public service, including representing South Carolina in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1999 until 2005, and then the U.S. Senate from 2005 through 2013. As a legislator, he focused on reforming policy in a whole host of issues, including healthcare, education, taxes, and entitlements. We're also very pleased to have Mr. DeMint on our board of directors at ACI. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Evelyn. Great to be with you.
Jim, I'm just so pleased that with all of your experience in government that you're joining us today for this extremely important conversation. You know, the United States Constitution is, I believe, the oldest still relevant governing document in the world. And we've lasted for a long time under the Constitution. Today, it's being severely challenged. There's no question about it. And if we didn't have it, we'd be gone already, believe me. It was there for a very specific purpose, because I think people recognize that there is a natural tendency for mankind to want to dominate everybody around it. And previous governments did that. They had their foot on everybody's neck, dictating what they could do, what they couldn't do, what they could say, how they could say it, where they could go. And, you know, there were enough people around the world who said, but we don't want that kind of system. We want a system that is surrounded by the concept of rights for the people who live there. And it should be of, by, and for the people, not of, for, and by the government. And our Constitution was specifically designed to ensure that we remained people-centric instead of government-centric. Only if we ignore that Constitution does it become problematic.
Well, Ben, it's very important that we're talking about this today. And what you just said, people need to know how unique it was at the time, and really still is today, that a government is formed to protect the rights of people, not to tell them what to do. It was very unique at the time. And today we even hear people questioning whether or not we need a constitution. So I'm grateful for you and Evelyn and the American Cornerstone Institute for opening up this discussion, because it's really common sense if we think about it. Whenever people come together and decide to pursue some goal, some mission together, they need to agree in advance on the rules and what their purpose is and who is going to lead and what roles different people play. I mean, it's true in marriage and family. It's certainly true in sports. If you think about trying to play a football game without all the teams and the players agreeing on what the rules are, where the boundaries are, and there are officials to actually oversee that those rules are followed. And that's how the Constitution came about. The King of England was not following the common law that was supposed to go to the colonists as well as to the English people. And the Declaration of Independence lays out all the things the king does to ignore what the rules of the game are. And that's why they felt justified in separating themselves and forming a new government. And the Declaration laid out kind of a vision and some of the aspirations of the idea of equality, that rights come from God. It laid out a lot of those things. And then years later, the Constitution actually laid down the rules of the game. And we need to make sure we know what those rules are and respect them.
Absolutely. And, I think you bring out one of the most important points, and that is our rights as declared by our founding documents come from God.
Exactly.
And not from the government. And therefore, the government should not be able to take those rights away. Now, one thing that's very interesting that's going on in today's United States is one of our rights is being taken away, not necessarily by the government, but with the compliance of the government.
Exactly.
And that is freedom of speech, freedom of thought. And if we allow big tech to take that away and the media to take that away and to impose severe restrictions on what you can say and punishments if you voice something that they don't like, it's just as evil as if the government had done it. And this is something that we have to make sure that the American people understand, because it frequently starts with subterfuge and people don't actually recognize what's going on until it's too late. Mm-hmm. And somehow we're going to have to figure out, how do we get these big tech and media people under control without suppressing their rights. And that's where the difficulty comes in, because we don't want to censor the censors, because we'll be just as bad as they are. But have you given any thought to how we can restore freedom of thought and freedom of speech in our country?
Given it a lot of thought, and at our organization, the Conservative Partnership, Rachel Bovard is leading the national effort to try to come up with solutions, working with Congress. But you mentioned something important, Ben, in that this is maybe not directly government, but what we're seeing is big government. The bigger it gets, the more it is allied with big corporations, big tech companies, big pharmaceutical companies, big corporations, and these bigs are controlling our lives. And we need to remember that the Constitution, the Bill of Rights particularly, lays out that our freedom of speech is to be protected. And what we have to realize now is a lot of our freedom of speech is dependent on the conduits in the private sector, such as the big tech, social media companies. And you also mentioned another important distinction. We don't want the government to take it over and try to regulate it. The first priority is to try to make sure there's competition. But just like with AT&T and the big telephone companies years ago, it was hard to have competition when there was a singular infrastructure that was taking a telephone line into the homes of families. You couldn't have 10 different lines going in. And so this is a situation where the market is not working. So those who say we need to be laissez-faire, let the market work, are not recognizing that whenever there's a monopoly or a quasi-monopoly, the market no longer works. And the point of antitrust laws is to come in and figure out how to deal with that. So there are some things that we're discussing right now. The big tech companies have protection from liability if they violate your rights. No other media has that. And I think that's one of the things we should look at taking away, although that comes with its own set of problems as well. So this is a very complicated process, but one that we have to resolve, because it's become very clear that these big tech companies think that they are so big that they no longer have to worry about what the people think. And part of that, Ben, is because a lot of their revenue comes from governments at all levels and all around the world buying their data about us. When we use Zoom, you can guarantee, this is free, but you can be assured that they are selling this data And that is one way they make money. And we need to understand that while we want the market to work, we want private companies to make money. We have to realize that our freedom of speech has become dependent on this, and we've got to solve this problem.
And I think probably the reason that, the very First Amendment dealt with freedom of speech is because almost all your other freedoms are going to be dependent on that.
Yeah.
And if you lose that, you really have changed the dynamic tremendously. And you end up with a government that basically begins to dictate. And we've already seen that tendency in several of the governors during this COVID crisis, just becoming little dictators.
Right.
Instead of relying upon the legislators who are the people who really truly represent the people and get the daily input from the people, which is the way it was supposed to be. And, that was the whole ideal behind federalism. And the reason that our Constitution says that anything that isn't specifically delegated as a federal responsibility falls to the states. There was a very good reason for that, because that's where the people are. And it's supposed to be about the people. It's not supposed to be about the government.
Ben, that's a real important point that's being discussed today. People are wondering why we don't have national elections. Why aren't presidents elected by the popular vote? Why do states get to decide things when we have a federal government to decide it? We need to go back to where we came from and what this country was about. It was 13 states coming together of trying to figure out how to have a more perfect union while keeping their autonomy and rights as states. And the Constitution set it up where there are no national elections. Even the president, him or herself, is not elected by a popular vote. It is by electors that come from the states. And the Constitution set out that the state legislators would appoint the US senators. And this gave the states a lot of control, because their biggest concern at the Constitutional Convention was losing their rights as states while they were trying to bring a union together for common defense and for justice and equality. They did not want to have a national, democratically elected government, which a lot of people have lost sight of. And that's why they're talking about, why do we need an electoral college?
Right.
We need it because it protects the rights of smaller states.
I hope there's more discussion of that, because I don't think the average American actually understands the function of the electoral college. And they don't understand how, if we went to a straight populist vote, we would disenfranchise many of the states. They would just exist, but they would have no voice whatsoever in what was going on. And I don't think anybody really thinks that that's fair, except for the power grabbers.
Yeah.
So it's really problematic. But there's so many other issues, like life itself. The whole concept of, is there a right to live? And we are seeing a coarseness occurring in our society, when it comes to babies in the womb, when it comes to people living out on the streets, people who are drug addicts. All of these individuals do have a right to life, and the government is there to protect that right to life. And when we discard that, it starts a whole cascade of things that really are antithetical to the creation of our nation.
Well, our founders, as you know, Ben, and the Declaration just laid out some examples of unalienable rights. The first one was right to life. And certainly we apply that to the unborn, but also, as you said, everyone in society, the old, the folks who are homeless, the folks who are poor, the uneducated, everyone has a right to life, a God-given right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the governments are instituted, as we are told, to protect those rights, not to give the rights to us or to take them away, but to protect them. And so the government wasn't set up to take care of people and to provide all these things that we expect it to provide today. The first thing it was supposed to provide is the rights given to us directly by our God.
And, when you go back and you look at some of the evil things that have happened in human history, like Nazism, it sort of started out with the very elderly and deformed people and people who were thought to be a burden on society. They really didn't have a right to live. And then it just continued to spread to more and more individual groups that didn't have a right to live. And that's why it's so important never to start going down that slope. Yeah. Because then it becomes a matter of opinion about who has a right to live. And that's a very dangerous place to empower people.
It is, this idea of opinion versus rule of law. I mean, what our founders would say, the rule of men, which was opinion, or the rule of law. The Constitution puts in place a format for laws to be developed by the consent of the people, and for those laws to be enforced, that we live by laws, not by opinion or arbitrary decisions. And today it seems, and you mentioned the governors who were becoming kind of just little dictators. We see there's an inclination in a lot of people, particularly politicians, to try to control people's lives, to tell them what to do, where they can go, what they can think. It's now even getting into violating religious liberty. If you have a certain set of biblical beliefs, we see that now our country is against us in a lot of ways. And we've got to go back to this agreement that was made with the consent of the people that we call the Constitution, that protects our right. It doesn't protect our right to hurt anyone else or to impose our opinion on anyone else, but it protects our right to say what we believe, to have the religion, the faith that we decide voluntarily. And a lot of people are questioning those, and that's because we're moving away from this basic agreement that that the states and the people made in the beginning that we call our Constitution.
Well, Jim, when you think about some of the things that are going on today, one of the things that's happening is that we are creating such enormous debt that is going to have to be paid by somebody, probably our children and our grandchildren. And it was Thomas Jefferson who said it's immoral to borrow from future generations. But isn't that exactly what we're doing? And when you think about the creation of the Constitution, it was also a monetary issue that was going on, because a lot of the colonists after the Revolutionary War, they had some debt, and no one wanted to extend credit to them, and their tax collectors were merciless. Yeah. And they began to say, we can't go on living like this. Right. And a guy by the name of Daniel Shea got a bunch of people together, and they attacked the armory. It was unsuccessful, but I think that whole revolutionary mindset made it very clear that we needed to have a constitutional convention and come up with better ways to govern locally and nationally.
Yeah, exactly. The Shays Rebellion actually, I think, was the final straw that pushed all the states to come together to form a more perfect union. The Articles of Confederation were very loose agreement, very informally enforced. And as you said, that you had people who had debt and could not pay their bills, yet the states were going after them, and they wanted some kind of protection from all of these taxes that they couldn't afford. So there was a lot went on that pushed this constitutional convention together, but the states were very resistant, and people don't understand that today. The last thing they wanted was a national government.
Exactly.
But what they knew they needed were states that could work together in a coordinated fashion so that goods could be sold across state lines, that they could have a mutual defense, they could have a military to defend themselves, and trade agreements that work. There were some things they had to have to operate together as states. But remember that the name they came up with was not just America, it was the United States.
Mhm.
Being states was really important, and it still is today, because instead of one central power, if we have 50 states with a lot of autonomy, which means that we don't have as much centralized power, we can live a lot freer. And if California wants high taxes and a lot of regulations, then people can move to other states. And that's what we see happening. And that kind of competition between states for the best education system, the best healthcare system, is healthy for our country. If we have a one-size-fits-all federal solution, that doesn't unite people, that divides people.
And one of the things that many people on the left have criticized about the United States, and therefore about our founding and our founding documents, is they say that slavery existed in our country. And therefore, whoever came up with these documents, if they were agreeable to slavery, they were evil, and we can negate anything that they had to say. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. Yeah. And of course, what that doesn't take into account is the fact that slavery has been around since there have been people. Yeah. That doesn't make it right. It's a horrible institution, but it has been around. And in fact, there's more slavery today in the world than there was in 1863 when the Emancipation Proclamation was put forth. So these people claim that we are evil because of it, but the fact of the matter is it's a wart. It's a human frailty that we were a part of. But what really made us unique is that there were so many people in the United States who were opposed to slavery that we were willing to fight a civil war and lose a substantial portion of our population in order to end such an evil institution. And that's probably what we need to be telling our children. What can we learn and about the nobility of the people who were willing to give their lives to stop evil in this country?
Ben, it's a really important point. A lot of folks are saying today that because the United States wasn't perfect when we signed the Constitution, that it was somehow the Constitution was flawed, when in fact the Declaration combined with the Constitution has been a North Star that keeps pulling us in a positive direction. As you mentioned, slavery was prevalent all over the world. Mm-hmm. And it was an astounding thing that our Declaration said all men, and at the time it meant all men and women, are created equal. When they signed that, everyone wasn't equal. Women certainly weren't equal. Black Americans weren't equul. And there were a lot of others who weren't treated equally just because of the countries they came from. But
only the landowners could vote.
Yeah. I mean, so it did not come true right away, but it keeps pulling us in the right direction. And I think Americans can be proud that we did a lot to eliminate formal slavery all around the world. But as you point out, even in the United States with human trafficking and sex trafficking, we have more actual slaves in our country than we did at the time of the Civil War. Folks don't want to recognize that. That's a problem we need to solve. But this a lot of the anti-slavery movement was pushed by people of faith. So was civil rights, so was women's suffrage. If you look back through our country's history, the Judeo-Christian biblical ideas have combined, actually inspired our founding documents. And that is what's kept pushing us in a positive direction, far from perfection. But Americans should be proud of what we've done and keep pushing to be better.
And look at, on the racial side, how much progress has been made. And, you hear all this stuff about systemic racism in America. But if we are a systemically racist country, how do you explain the fact that Nigerians, Ghanaians, and a lot of other people who come here who have Black skin do extremely well, and there's no wealth gap associated with them? And I think it tells you that there may be problems, there may be obstacles, but that's why we have determination. That's why we have brains. That's why we figure these things out. And there have been obstacles for all kinds of people who have come here and who exist in other parts of the world. It's part of human existence. It's not to justify it by any stretch of the imagination, but to recognize that the real obstacles sometimes are not the easiest thing to find. Sometimes it's easier just to point a finger at something, say, that's what it is. Just like, yesterday or the day before that on The View, they were saying that the vice president is actually doing a great job, but because she's Black and she's a woman, they're going to criticize her. What a bunch of garbage. But it's very easy sometimes to just pick on something and claim that, this is unfair, this is racist. And the way that our system was put together, look at what it yielded. After slavery, after Jim Crow, look at what our system has yielded. When I was a kid and a Black person would come on television in a non-servile role, everybody was so excited. They said, hey, come to the living room, come see this. And, now, within my lifetime, easily, you have, Black generals and admirals and CEOs of Fortune 500 companies and presidents of prestigious universities. We've had a Black vice president, a Black president. The list goes on and on. And, in a relatively short period of time, all of that has occurred. What does that say about our country? That says that we have made a concerted effort to correct some past wrongs. And I think we're probably one of the least racist societies, as indicated by the fact that this is a country that people form caravans trying to get into, people who are minorities. Now, why would they be trying to get into a place that's systemically racist? Either they're really stupid or we're not systemically racist, one or the other.
Well, Ben, you and I are about the same age, although I'm a lot older than you. I think I'm 2 or 3 weeks older than you are. But you grew up at a time when there really was systemic racism. I mean, there were real obstacles everywhere,
Absolutely.
Education or whatever. But even then, there were people like you who could just, through their own choices and hard work, and I think primarily like me, just a good mother who's just kept kicking in the rear end, and you overcame that. And today there's still residual problems from long-term discrimination that we need to fix. But it's not because people are deliberately discriminating against people because of the color of their skin. They may be discriminated against because they don't have the skills they need to do a particular job. We can fix those things, or because they don't have the right education. So what worries me most about the discussion of systemic racism is if you don't understand the root causes of the problem, you're not going to be able to fix them. So we do need to recognize their problems. But I've consulted with hundreds of companies before I ever got into politics. I've been in dozens and dozens of organizations. And for decades, there has not been any kind of deliberate discrimination. In fact, it's been very much the other way. But there have been a lot of residual effects of long-term discrimination against Blacks, against women, against the poor in our country. Those are things we need to try to fix, but it does disturb me.
Absolutely. Well, you know, the interesting thing is in college, I was a psychology major. I was fully planning to become a psychiatrist, to be honest with you, but I eventually went from the intangible to the tangible aspects of the brain. But interesting, one of the things that we learned is people tend to interpret what they see and what they hear based on what they already think.
Yeah.
So if I've already concluded that you're a racist, then everything you say, see, I told you he was a racist. Whereas if I've already concluded that you're not a racist, I say that you can say exactly the same thing. I say, see, he's not a racist. You know, yeah. And that's why it's so poisonous what the media and the big tech and some of the other organizations are doing, trying to poison people's minds. Things like critical race theory, teaching little white kids that, you know, they're evil and their parents are evil and their grandparents, and little Black kids that they're victims of a society. You know, why would you put all that into somebody's head? And, you know, the Bible says in Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, and not depart from it. That means it's very important what you're putting into that mind during those formative years. And of course, the Marxists have known that too. And that's why, you know, Vladimir Lenin said, give me your children to teach for 4 years, and the seeds that I plant will never be uprooted. And that's why they've worked so hard to indoctrinate our children, and why we must work even harder to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Exactly. I'm afraid, and after working in Washington for 20 years, it's become evident that I'm afraid in this case, the Democrat Party is using racial division as well as all kinds of other division, putting us in groups to create political power. And we've seen that throughout history, dividing people into groups, pitting them against one another, telling them some are victims and that we need the government to protect us. It's it really is sinister in a lot of ways. What I hope for is just one America for all Americans. And that's why a lot of us are working on what we call the American movement, Ben, is that it's really not about political parties. It's about those ideas that make this country great, that we're the most diverse country in the whole world, but like you said, we're the least discriminatory. Although there are always going to be people who make decisions for wrong reasons, we can't paint the whole country whenever we find someone who is doing that. But we've got a great history. The Constitution that we started talking about today gives us a foundation to build on. But the government exists by the consent of the people. And the people have to have good information. And that brings us back to big tech. If they don't know the truth about COVID or about the border, the truth about January the 6th, those riots, what really happened, if we can't find the truth out from the medical community or from the media, I'm most concerned today that a government of the people cannot exist if there's no real source of truth. So that's kind of my passion here late in life, I guess I can say, that I want people to understand the sources of truth that we can look to so that we can be a government that is ruled by the consent of the people.
Well, you're so correct. I mean, that hits the nail right on the head, because, you know, the only business protected by our Constitution is the press. And that's because they were supposed to disseminate unbiased information to the people. so that the country could be ruled by the will of the people. But when the press puts its thumb on the scale and decides that they want to manipulate the way that things are done and the way people think, it completely distorts the original intent of what was going to happen in this country. And I think we're seeing the results of that right now. Just chaos reigning supreme in our streets, confusion. I think most people feel that we're moving in the wrong direction. And what is the logical conclusion of when you sow seeds of discord? Maybe you think you have a good reason because you're trying to accumulate power, but the seeds of discord never end in a good place. They haven't historically, and they won't end in a good place here. Now, fortunately, we still have enough freedom in this country that the people, and again, this is about the people, can make a difference. And you're starting to see it already. These parent groups who are going to school board meetings, people are starting to go to other public meetings and making their voices heard. I think more people are starting to contact their representatives. And, we are extremely fortunate to have a system where there is separation of powers. Now, it needs to be enforced. I will tell you that because, for instance, we do have some rogue judges. And so according to the Constitution, Congress is supposed to oversee that situation, and they have the power to remove those individuals. I don't think they've ever exercised that power, quite frankly. And so we see the proliferation of some of these rogue judges. That does immeasurable damage to the confidence that people have in the system of government. And when you have an executive branch that tries to rule by executive order, as opposed to allowing the bicameral Congress to do its job, again, that distorts the system. I understand that sometimes things need to be done quickly, and that's why you have executive orders. But I think that was originally put in place because there were certain things that needed to be done quickly that didn't have time to wait. Certainly when we're dealing with some of the natural disasters and things of that nature, it wasn't meant that the whole government should be run that way, though.
You're right. And the Constitution lays that out really very clearly. And it's why we need to keep referring back to it. It lays out that the Congress, made up of the House and the Senate, they make the laws. And then the executive branch is supposed to carry out those laws. Congress has deferred so much power to the executive and judicial branches that they write very vague laws and expect the executive branch to come up with thousands of pages of regulations, which are essentially laws that aren't passed by Congress. So I think we need to keep looking at the intent of the Constitution, why it has lasted so long, and try to do some self-correcting here. Because as you said, all these executive orders, every president seems to try to do more than the one before, starting with getting rid of the executive orders of the last president. And that's a very unstable way to govern. And it's certainly not a government of the people if bureaucrats are making laws and they're not even elected and they're not accountable to the people. So Congress has made a lot of mistakes, as has the executive branch. But the Constitution tells us how laws should be made and how they should be executed. And we need to look back at the Constitution to correct that.
Well, Jim, you've had a very long, distinguished career in the legislative branch of government. Have you witnessed a coarsening of the relationships between the two parties? And what do you think is behind it?
Yes, there is a coarsening. It's very different now than it was when I first came to the House almost 20 years ago, actually more than 20 years ago, when there were a lot of Democrats who we call blue dog Democrats, who were kind of common sense, that you could work with them. And the differences between the parties then was just kind of, what's the role of government here? How much should we spend? How much should we tax? Now the differences are more of different realities of what is real in the world, what is true. They were talking about kind of what's American and what's anti-American, where there's a party now that truly, and a lot of the things they think are anti-American. It's hard to find the compromise there. And every time, Ben, I almost have to laugh if it wasn't so sad. Every time I hear they're going to do something bipartisan, like with the infrastructure bill, I know exactly what it is. The only bipartisan thing that's going to go through Congress now is more spending or a new government program. And the Republicans like to say we made it better because instead of 3 trillion, it's only 1.2 trillion. And actually some of that is going to go to roads and bridges, but not much. And that's the kind of bipartisanship we have. But the incivility towards people inside, it has gotten much, much worse. And the problem with that, Ben, is that's an example for the nation. Much of what we see played out around the country comes from the incivility in the rhetoric and actual behavior that we see from our political leaders. And we've got to fix that. I think in the past, of course, there have been people who hit each other with canes on the floor. It's never been perfect. But a lot of the incivility was hidden, but now it's performed in front of C-SPAN. And so America gets the sense that this is who we are. You're not only going to disagree with someone, you're going to try to denigrate them and tear them down, ruin their reputation. It's something that I've been talking about a lot lately because I've written a book that's about the Bible and biblical truth. And I just
think it's a very good book, by the way. It's a very interesting book. I recommend it highly.
We forget that this country was formed on Judeo-Christian ideas that come right out of the Bible. And when you throw the Bible out of school, you can't teach creation anymore. Biblical morality is considered hate speech. But the idea of rule of law and charity and love for one another, all the things that made us uniquely Americans come out of this Bible that we're throwing away. So somehow we have to help people see that the idea of the separation of states, which is not in the Constitution, is not in the Declaration, is just an idea that the government cannot promote one religion over another. But it doesn't suggest in any way that our country cannot be based on faith and biblical ideas, that that education couldn't include Judeo-Christian concepts. But we cannot expect to keep the America that we love if we don't understand that all our ideas came from the Bible.
Absolutely. And, that is the first cornerstone of the American Cornerstone Institute, faith.
Yeah.
And that teaches us how to relate to our fellow man, love your neighbor. And the opposite of that is cancel your neighbor. If they disagree with you, cancel them. And yet, one of the things that's great about America in the past is that you did have the ability to disagree. You don't have to be disagreeable, but you can have your own ideals, your own thoughts. That's why so much innovation came out of America. Yeah. When Alexis de Tocqueville came here in 1831, the Europeans, they wanted somebody to analyze what the heck is going on in America. How can those fledgling young people be competing with us on every level? That's ridiculous. And when he came over and sort of did an in-depth analysis of everything, at the end, he was very impressed by our pulpits.
Yeah.
And by what came out of those pulpits and how it inspired the people. And he concluded that America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to be worried about right now. That goodness, and that goodness came from that Judeo-Christian foundation of love and respect for your fellow man.
And so did our rights, is the place we started here. Our rights come from God. They're laid out in a lot of ways in the Bible, how we treat each other, the whole idea of equality, which we will never perfectly attain, but we have to keep striving for. But if we lose that vision of biblical truth, there's nothing else to guide us. And even the Constitution itself derives its power and its guidance from the Bible. So we've got to connect these points here, because all the problems we're dealing with in Washington and around the country are just symptoms of the loss of Judeo-Christian ideas and the death of truth.
Absolutely. So well said. And, we also have to, once again, have some faith and confidence in the people. One of the things that was the greatest part of running for president for me back in 2016 was meeting people from all over this country, in the smallest little towns and hamlets and in North Dakota and South Carolina. And what I discovered is that most of the American people have common sense.
Yeah.
And there's a reason it's called common sense. It doesn't exist much in DC, but in other parts of the country, there's a lot of it. And we need to have faith in those people and their common sense, And one of the press conferences a couple of days ago, the press secretary was saying, why do you need to know that information?
Yeah.
About how many people had breakthrough infections. The implication being, we know what's going on and we'll take care of it. You guys don't need to know anything. That is completely antithetical to the concept of a nation that is up for and by the people. Exactly. And we have to get back to having confidence in the people and in their good judgment, because in a sense, they're much more concerned with the concepts of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and not so much about the accumulation of political power. Therefore, I think we can take a lot of stake and a lot of confidence in what the people think.
You're exactly right. And we certainly see that the establishment in Washington now and a lot of politics around the country with the COVID situation, instead of giving people good information, telling them who's at risk and who's not, and asking them to voluntarily do things that protect themselves. And most Americans could do that. There's an assumption by a lot of politicians that people cannot make good decisions. So those decisions have to be made by a central power, which, as you said, is antithetical to the whole idea of a government of the people that exists by the consent of the people. Right. And that's what we're trying to get back to. That's why it's so important we talk about the Constitution. And I know in future sessions, you're going to get into the articles of the Constitution, how the government is going to be organized, how the power is divided, not only in Washington, but between Washington and the states. It's very interesting if people will actually take the time to read it.
Thank you. I wanted to thank you both for such an excellent conversation and inspiration for all of us. John Adams said, liberty cannot be preserved without a general knowledge among the people. And it's in that spirit that we are hosting these Read the Constitution discussions. We're so thankful for both of you to kick us off. There's obviously a lot to talk about in our subsequent discussions. And so, but it was really great to hear how we need to look at some of the issues that are facing our nation today and how we need to look back at the Constitution as our guiding star. So I will, we just have a couple minutes. I will give you, Senator DeMint, a couple minutes to wrap up and then have you close, Dr. Carson.
I've been honored to be here. Again, as I said before, I'm so grateful that that Ben and you, Evelyn, and their whole team at America Cornerstone are taking these cornerstone ideas of our country and communicating them to the American people so that they can be more capable of being a government of the people. So, and from the littlest patriot, and I know you've got a new children's book, and I love the way you're trying to communicate with all Americans. So grateful for this, and we cannot solve problems in Washington without the American people being informed and involved. So American Cornerstone is coming at just the right time.
And Jim, I just want to thank you for being a patriot. And, you know, for so many years, you've devoted your life to the improvement of the life of the people in this country. And, you know, you were instrumental in helping American Cornerstone get started. And, you know, your continued participation is very much appreciated, because we have to recognize that we're on the precipice right now, deciding which way this country is going to go. Are we, in fact, going to be the America of freedom that is people-centric? Or are we going to become the America where government knows best, and they take care of you from cradle to grave until they run out of money? Mm-hmm. And the people have to be involved in that. No one can be a wallflower. You can't just sit in the corner and hope that nobody calls you a nasty name. You got to get involved, and everybody has a sphere of influence. And I hope everyone listening will make it their business to get out there and make sure that everybody in their sphere of influence knows what's going on and is an active participant. We are the ones who guard the future for those who come after us.
Well, great. I want to thank our generous sponsors of the American Cornerstone Institute. If you like this event, please join us at americancornerstone.org. Thank you.